Welcome to Not Work Storytelling. This is the show where we untangle our myths and reweave our stories, one ancient tale at a time. I'm your host and lead storyteller, Marisa Gowdy. I'm a myth worker, a story healer, a coach for writers and creative entrepreneurs, and the author of The Sovereignty Knot, A Woman's Way to Freedom, Power, Love, and Magic. If you love what you hear and want to support the show as we enter our third season, I'd be so grateful if you become a paid subscriber on Substack. In my newsletter, Myth is Medicine, you'll receive bonus content related to the stories on the show and deep dives into how mythology and folklore can help the individual and the collective in the present moment and beyond. There's a link in the show notes to follow Myth is Medicine on Substack. Or you can simply visit mythismedicine.substack.com. Before we explore this week's story, I have a question for you. What about your stories? Whether it's a book project that wants to be birthed, deep, authentic writing to support your business, or a personal creative project you can't quite name yet, I'm here to support your process and help you get your words onto the page and into the world. I work with folks who are writing memoirs, chronicles of the spiritual journey, and books that explore healing in the imagination, even as they explore the toughest truths of life. I support entrepreneurs, especially coaches and therapists in private practice, who wish to weave their personal experiences with their professional knowledge and wisdom. Do you want to build a writing practice and develop the ideas you know you must share? Visit my website, marisagowdy.com, to learn more about my writing coaching services and set up a free 30-minute consultation. Season 3, Episode 10, Bride and the Cailleach, a Scottish Story. Our guest is Katy Swift. Katy is a socially engaged artist and storyteller from Northumberland and is now based in the Scottish borders. Her work aims to create social and political change with individuals, groups, or communities through weaving together Scottish Gaelic folklore, mythology, folk herbalism, and creative practices. She recently graduated with an MA in socially engaged art with the University of the Highlands and Islands, where she focused on how ritual and creative practices can help us to process our collective grief for the earth. Well, I am so excited to have Katy here on the podcast today. As is our way on Not Work Storytelling, first we ask the story to speak for itself, and then we'll explore together all the ways that it still resonates through life, then and now. So Katy, will you tell us a story?
Yes, thank you so much. Long ago, almost at the very beginning of time itself, the earth was covered in a vast ocean. Across the ocean strode a giantess. Around her shoulders she held a dun-coloured shawl, and on her back was a creel. This giant woman was known by many names, and one of these names was the Cailleach. She waded north. As she moved through the water, clods of mud she had gathered from the seabed began to fall from her creel. When she noticed this, she stopped. She felt a surge of vision and began to sculpt the clay. With her great hands, she sculpted mountains and hills. With her huge forearms, she carved valleys and glens. She dug her fingers into the rich, dark clay and drew rivers across the land. As she did this, the water began to flow along them. When she noticed this, she then dug deep, dark locks. Inspired, she began to dig up enormous rocks from the seabed. She carried them in her apron as she strode across her new land to create more of the landscape, and she dropped a few boulders as she went. She worked and worked until she felt happy with her creation, and she chose the tallest mountain as her throne, and this was Ben Nevis. The clay earth was fertile. It was soon covered in green life. Thousands of wild, magical, and medicinal plants and trees sprang up. From shore to shore, The land was covered in the thick Caledonian forest. Scots pine, ash, elm, birch, oak, yew, and sycamore grew deep roots, strong trunks, and wide branches. Life began to spread in all its forms through the forest, in the valleys, in the lochs, rivers, and across the beaches. Time passed. So much time that the Cailleach stopped noticing it pass. The giantess's creative energy continued, and she became the mother to many gods and goddesses, giants and men. In fact, she had many giant sons. Some were horned like deer, and others had many heads. Sometimes they would quarrel and sit atop of the mountains and throw rocks at each other. And she would have to punish them by locking them for a while inside the mountains. But she loved them. Over time, her skin became blue and mottled, wrinkled and aged. Her long hair became white as frost. Her one giant eye remained keen as an eagle, and it would dart quickly around like a mackerel's. Her teeth were sharp, and they became rust red. To many, she would have been terrifying. Now the Cailleach had other powers. She would call upon the freezing north winds, and she could control the storm clouds. She could call the snow and hail. She had a magical blackthorn staff, and when she would strike the ground with it, the earth would freeze as hard as iron. She became a winter goddess and reigned over the land. And oh, how she loved the land. She loved to wander across the land she had created, hopping across the mountains as if they were stepping stones. And she loved the animals, and they loved her in return. She would be followed by foxes and wolves, eagle and deer. You would know she was near, because the eagles would shriek with joy to see her. And it's said that she would protect the deer from hunters because she loved them so. Every year, she would wash her great dun-coloured shawl just off the Isle of Jura, creating the enormous cauldron, the Corryvreckan whirlpool. When the shawl was clean and white, she would throw it across the mountains to dry. She still does that to this day. You might have seen it. It was hard, though, for the people of these frozen lands to live in endless winter. This great freeze eventually left many hungry, and the men and women in the clans of the mountains and the valleys would gather by their small fires, trying to stay warm and sharing stories. One story was passed from village to village, barely a whisper to begin with, but it grew. That there was a child so beautiful that whoever looked upon her face would feel the same warmth that they'd feel from the hearth fire. You couldn't help but feel hope when you saw her bright eyes, and her smile melted you like ice. Some said that a child like this had the potential to bring an end to the Winter Queen's reign. When the Cailleach heard this, she thought it was so offensive that she raged and threw hail and ice and snow at the land, even harder to punish those that challenged her in this way. But as tends to happen when times become hard, the story grew in strength. And the old woman muttered of a prophecy that a beautiful young woman would rise up and would defeat the Cailleach. The Cailleach herself heard this and began to fret. Fear of losing her beautiful, beloved land made her blood run cold. Losing everything she had built, her queendom, everything she had taken for granted suddenly seemed a little more fragile, a little less certain. It ate away at her until it turned to anger. Who was this child? What had she done to deserve these lands? How could she possibly be stronger, more powerful than the giantess who created the land herself? Surely beauty wouldn't triumph over her wisdom and experience. So the Cailleach and her 8 storm hags searched the land, coast to coast, every village, every town, until they found her, the child. Her name was Bride. The Cailleach took her and kept her prisoner underneath Ben Nevis. She gave her the meanest of tasks to keep her occupied. Over time, Bride's clothes turned to rags, and her hands were rough from the hard work. But she had only grown in beauty and radiance. She became a glowing, radiant young woman. She worked away without complaint, which somehow only made the Cailleach despise her more. So, one day, the Cailleach gave Bride an impossible task. Take this brown fleece to the river and wash it until it's pure white. I don't want to see a speck of brown left on it. Do not return to me until you have done this. Bride did as she was told. She washed and washed the fleece in the ice-cold water until her fingers were numb. But of course, the fleece remained brown. When she returned, the Cailleach scolded her and called her lazy. She told her she'd need to go back to the river tomorrow and every day until the fleece was as white as the snow on the ground. And so this went on for days, until one day, Bride was scrubbing the fleece in the icy river, her hands red raw. She couldn't take any more. She threw the fleece to the ground and began to weep. Just then, a grey-bearded old man stepped out of the snow-covered trees. "Why are you crying, child?" he asked. Bride looked up, held up the fleece, and began to explain. "Well, I have to wash this fleece until it's white, but it's impossible." The old man reached out and took the wet brown fleece. He shook it once, twice, 3 times, and on the third time, it suddenly gleamed as white as snow. Bride gasped, and her heart leapt with joy. "Who are you?" she cried. "I am old Father Winter," he said. "You must take this to your queen with a message and these." He handed her a small bunch of white snowdrops. Bride had never seen anything like them. She was delighted. "Tell the queen that these flowers are growing in the fir woods. Cress is springing up on the banks of the streams, and new grass is shooting up in the fields underneath the snow." Bride thanked him and ran as fast as she could back to the foot of Ben Nevis, with the fleece in one hand and the snowdrops in the other. She ran into the queen's hall and threw herself at her feet, barely able to contain her excitement, because surely now the goddess would be pleased with her. The Cailleach saw the snowdrops first and almost fainted with fear to see the strange flowers that she herself had never seen. She had not created those. Her fear turned to anger. And when she heard the message Bride had been given by old Father Winter, she struck her and banished her to a room underneath the mountain. But the joy in Bride's heart didn't fade, because now she knew there were powers other than the Cailleach. There was something happening. Change was coming, and something was stirring in her own body too. The Cailleach summoned her 8 hag servants, riding on their 8 shaggy goats, and sent them in all directions to blast the land with hail and wind. and she rode on her grey mare across the land, striking the ground with her staff so that it was hard, so hard that no flower or shoot could stand the chance of bursting through. Now, across the land, in the emerald green Isle of Youth across the sea, one of the Cailleach's sons, Angus, the ever young, had a dream. He dreamt of the most beautiful woman that he had ever seen, weeping by a river. She was dressed in rags, and even though she was crying, she looked like the most beautiful and absolutely perfect maiden. And she was so perfect that he fell in love. In the morning when he woke, Angus could not stop thinking about the dream. So he went to the king of the Green Isle and he asked him about the woman he dreamt of. Ah, said the king, that is Bride. She's kept captive by the Cailleach, the Winter Queen, who's cruel to her. No one knows where. But one day in the future, you will be king of summer and she will be your queen. Well, of course, Angus was delighted. And he couldn't wait to find her, to rescue her, to hold her. The king warned him that it was too soon. The Cailleach's power was all too great still. Angus should wait until he matured a bit, until his own powers grew. He's still just too young. But youth always knows best and can never wait, and Angus could not wait. The king warned him again. Angus, it's the wolf month now. Uncertain is the temper of the wolf. Wait a while. The sea was stormy and dark, and the waves were much too high for him to cross. But Angus instead cast a spell on the sea and a spell on the land. He borrowed 3 days from August so that the waves would become calm and he could ride across on his magical white horse. And so he arrived on the land. He began to search the frozen forests for Bride, with only his crimson red cloak to shield him from the wind, rain, and hail. He searched and he searched. Meanwhile, Bride dreamt of Angus. She saw how hard he searched for her and how he would not give up hope. And when she woke, she thought about how it might be possible for her to escape, and she wept tears of joy. As the tears landed on the floor, they turned to violet, the colour of her beautiful eyes. The Cailleach, of course, heard that her son Angus had arrived. She heard that he was searching for Bride, and she raised a huge storm that sent him back to the Green Isle. But he returned as soon as he'd gathered his strength, and he kept searching until one day, Bride slipped away from where she was being held under the mountain. She wandered through the forest as if under a spell, down to the river. And wherever she stepped, primroses sprang up from the ground. She cried more tears of joy, which of course sprang up as violets. And when they saw her, the birds began to sing. And it was here, of course it was here, that Angus finally saw her. When they found each other and recognized one another from their dreams, they fell absolutely head over heels in love. The kind of love that only the young tumble into. First love. And that was the first day of spring. As they were talking and gazing at each other and holding one another and soaking each other up, they didn't notice that a huge procession of fairies had arrived in the clearing, the Fairy Queen's court. The Fairy Queen herself was there and she spoke to them and told them of their destiny, that they had a long and challenging road ahead, with many battles to be won against the Cailleach, but that eventually they would rule over these lands as the king and queen of summer. The fairy queen waved her hand, and Bride's ragged clothing became transformed into a beautiful white robe with a white hooded cloak. She looked so fine standing beside Angus the ever young in his green royal clothes. In her hair appeared spring flowers, violets, daisies, and pale pink wild roses. In her hand appeared a wand entwined with woven cornstalks. In her other hand, a golden horn appeared. This would become known as the Horn of Plenty. And at that moment, a small bird, a linnet, let out the most beautiful song celebrating Bride's freedom. It made even the stern fairy queen smile, and she said, "Linnet, from now on you will be called the bird of Bride." Across the land this song spread, through the fields and trees, all the way to the shore. And the first bird on the beaches to sing this song was the oyster catcher, who sang so happily that the fairy queen heard and said, "Oyster catcher, you will be known as the page of Bride from now on." Angus and Bride followed the fairy queen's procession all the way into the side of a green hill and down the long hallway to the other world. And there they were married, and there was a great feast, followed by the most incredible party in the queen's magnificent palace. The joy rippled out into this realm, and everyone in the whole land felt the warmth of the sun on their faces as they raised a toast to the newlyweds. When Bride and Angus emerged, Angus recited magical spells which made the grass grow green and tall. Bride waved her hand, and wee buds appeared on the trees. Now, while this was happening, the Cailleach and her hag servants were drawing upon all of their strength. And just as Bride and Angus began to relax into the spring warmth, the hags mounted their shaggy goats and set off in all directions to blast the land with freezing rain. The Cailleach struck the ground with her staff and froze it as hard as iron again. Angus pulled Bride up onto his white horse and fled with her. The Cailleach mounted her grey mare and raced after him. As she urged her horse to leap across a rocky ravine on the island of Tyree, the horse's front hooves left a huge imprint in the landscape, known to this day as Le Monique, the horse's leap. But the lovers escaped to the Green Isle and spent a few days there enjoying one another, safe from the Cailleach's powers. Until after a wee while, Angus crossed the ocean again, only to be blasted back to the Green Isle by the winter goddess. This happened time and time again. The Cailleach would rise cruel winds and beat the ground to prevent anything more from growing. Then came the weeks of leanness. Food became scarce. Many went hungry in those last days of winter. The stores of food ran out for humans and animals alike. Many sheep and cattle died. Folk used the last of their wood to keep warm. Hope began to dwindle. And the battle between Angus and the Cailleach raged on, back and forward, until Bride walked across the ocean from the Green Isle. She stepped through the land, warming the earth with her feet, and she dipped her hands into the highest rivers, melting the very last of the ice. The Cailleach let out a last scream and threw her blackthorn staff under a holly bush. where she then lay down and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. And Angus and Bride were crowned the king and queen of summer at last.
Oh, Katy, thank you for that story. What a gift. What a journey. I'm just, I'm struck by how it's a love story at so many levels. Just the way you say the Cailleach loved the land, and then knowing
Yeah.
about the love between Bride and Angus, and then just the love of the earth itself for its people and its desire to be renewed. What a gift. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh. So, knowing that Knotwork storytelling tends to tend toward the Irish stories, listeners who've been with us for 3 seasons have heard most of these names before, right? We know that Angus has appeared in the Cailleach, and Bride, in the form of Bridget, has been on the show several times at this point. So I first want to just begin with saying thank you for offering us the Scottish tradition and giving us this. I don't know, could we say it's sort of the cousins version of these stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many parallels between Bridget and Bride, and the same with Saint Bridget and Saint Bride that we have here in Scotland. And a lot of the the myths and the legends about Saint Bride. I mean, it's Saint Bridget, it's the same
Mhm.
person.
Right.
But Bride, the goddess here, is actually a very different being, I think. There are lots of similarities, but she's a very different being as well.
Yeah. And that was one reason I was so excited to have you on, because oftentimes around Imbolc, when it's February 1st and there's this telling of the lore of Bridget, there's so many of the Irish stories come in. And then you feel like, oh, then there's these little additions that feel exciting. And yet, wait, there's something so much more to that. And that's what you've brought us today with the sense of that relationship with Cailleach and Bride having such specific significance to the Scottish lands and the understanding of the Scottish seasons. Because, of course, just the fact that we're telling this story right here at the start of April has real significance too, right?
Yeah, on the 25th of March, we have Lana Cailleach, which is the day that the Cailleach throws her staff underneath the holly bush. It's
Mm.
also known as Ladies' Day. So the story is just ended now, hasn't it? And I think the story, it just so perfectly sums up the weather in Scotland
Mm.
over January and February, because we do get these false starts to spring every year. And I guess the story would have been a bit of a warning to people not to prematurely leap into spring.
Mhm.
And we have all these storms as well.
So, why don't you tell me a little bit about the source of this story and also how you've worked with it to really make it your own?
Yeah. So a lot of this story comes from Donald Alexander Mackenzie's Wonder Tales. He was a folklorist and a writer in the early 20th century. And he traveled all over Scotland collecting folklore and folk tales. And then he gathered them all up and wrote down his version of the story. But it's not my favorite version of the story, because I feel that in some ways it does Bride and the Cailleach a disservice, because the Cailleach is sort of presented as this cruel, wicked, almost like wicked stepmother.
Mm.
And his story starts with her capturing Bride and keeping her underneath the mountain. And she's in rags and she's doing chores. It's very Cinderella.
Mhm.
And then the fairy queen comes along and transforms her into this glowing white gowned princess. But my Cailleach is a creator. She's a powerful source of creativity. She's a fertile energy. She's the earth, and
Mhm.
she created the land. And it's quite hard to see this creator, that version of her, in Donald Alexander Mackenzie's version of the story.
Mm.
So I purposefully chose to begin earlier and to introduce her as, this mother goddess,
Mm.
actually.
Mm. Yeah, she's easy to fall in love with. And of course, it's that sense of you emphasize the power of time and passage and how she barely noticed. And yet she changed so much from going to being that creatrix, mother of all, and then describing her physical changes, how her skin turned blue and her hair white and her teeth like rust. And that metamorphosis that she went through, it's so beautiful and it's so it's funny. Part of me wants to say it's unexpected. And of course, we know that time passes and we know that all beings age, but giving her that space to move from being herself, that sort of bride of the world, that young being, into being the hag, the fearsome, loathsome lady. I'm so grateful to just have that chance to sit with the fullness of her story. So thank you for that.
Yeah. And she is often described in Scottish mythology as being terrifying.
Mm.
And I think that's the image of her that a lot of us have today, is just how fearsome she is. And I think when I tell this story, I'm not able to tell it without figuring out why she becomes cruel, why she captures pride. Yeah. And that's why I decided to.
As you and I were first connecting over this story, you and I are both in the mothering stage of life. And yet we're also seem to be women who are very aware of that full spectrum of, oh, right. And someday our hag time is coming, our time to be the crone, the Cailleach. Certainly reminded of Sharon Blackie's work. Have you read or come in contact with Hagitude yet? Her newest book?
I haven't read Hagitude, but I love If Women Rose Rooted.
Yeah, I think that's the start for so many women in our circle, right? That sense of like, oh, wait, we're not alone in these dreams. Someone else has already written this book. Thank you. And then we all just sort of get to branch out from there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in part, you're telling the story at this time of the year, just after March 25th, is so perfect. But I can't help but notice, just in how the synchronicities weave together, the story that I shared last week on Knotwork Storytelling was the story of Césaire, which is that story of Ireland's first woman, but it's also the story of the flood. And it's that sense of, the biblical flood, like as in the ark, and that sense of waters rising. And that's exactly where you began the story today, was exactly the moment where I ended last week.
Yeah.
A few hundred miles over and in a sort of different mythological world. And yet there's those commonalities we're all sharing here of saying, oh, certain things happened in the world, whether it was that God caused the floods to rise, or it was a sense of, well, the ice caps melted because the last ice age ended. These stories are all rooted in that sort of sense, in these commonalities, both biblical and ecological. So I find it just so remarkable that that's where your story began today.
Yeah. And the Cailleach, she controls the waters and brings floods in many stories. I mean, that's supposed to be where Loch O comes from. The Cailleach used to draw her water from a magical well every morning, and she would have to replace the lid of the well afterwards. And one day she forgets to replace the lid of the well and it floods up. And when she realizes it's too late and Loch O has already come into existence. And also some of the rivers. I mean, the River Ness was supposed to be the Cailleach's servant, Nessa, who forgot to replace the lid of a well. And Loch Ness came into existence, and the Cailleach scolded her and punished her by turning her into the River Ness.
Wow. That's so interesting. I mean, that it just underscores, we're in this moment now of being very aware of human engagement with the earth is causing climate change. And yet you look back and it's that sense of, right, when people were not mindful, when they were not being good stewards of the land or of the well, there was this belief and understanding that things went a little bit sideways. And I find that really remarkable the way, well, of course, that's why we go back to these old stories, right? Because it's always just reminding us of what was then is now and will be.
Yeah. And these stories are medicine because we're grieving, I think, as a species. we don't know where we're supposed to be in the natural order of things. And so these tales about when the natural order of things was disturbed and these things happen are just so, they're just so important to us right now.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Because things are happening out of season all over the earth right now. Right. And it's that sense of,
Mhm.
it feels in some ways, everyone's awakening more and more to this ecological consciousness, this understanding of, right, we live in rhythm with the earth. If we're in a part of the planet that has seasons, they really matter to us. And that moment of, yes, of course, you're not at your most bright and brilliant in January. You're supposed to be sitting in the cave, with a fire, surviving right now. But at that moment when so many people seem to be coming back to a consciousness of our connection to the earth, it's also at the same moment, and because those earthly cycles are a bit less predictable, right? And are
Yeah.
the trees budding? If I'm here in New York, we were watching the trees start to bud in January because we didn't really start getting snow until March. And it's just that sense of right now, as we're sitting here in April and the daffodils are up, I'm full of joy, but I'm also full of like, wait, I don't know that I followed all the usual steps to get to this point, but we're at spring again. Hallelujah. And do you think it'll snow tomorrow?
Yeah, it's a cycle. This story, it begins again at Samhain. It begins again in October, where the Cailleach awakes from her slumber,
Mm.
and the whole story starts again. So we have this Celtic wheel of the year, and it's explaining the seasons. And I think it would have provided a lot of comfort throughout the winter months for folk to know that spring will come again, and times were hard and there wasn't as much food, but it's going to come back. And I can't help but think that we don't get the same comfort from it now, because instead it just serves as such a stark reminder that everything's out of sync.
Mm. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, will you tell us a little bit about where you are in Scotland and what your connection to the earth is like, where do you get sustenance? What bits of the landscape really feed you?
Yeah, so I'm in the Scottish borders. I'm in a little town called Peebles. And I grew up actually just over the border in Northumberland, so really not far away. And it actually took me a long time to fall in love with this land.
Mm.
I was so hungry to travel. I was so desperate. As soon as I could, when I hit my 20s, I went traveling, searching for endless summer, maybe looking for my version of the Greena.
Mm.
And I avoided winter for lots of years. But
Mm.
now that I'm back on these lands, I can't believe I didn't see the beauty in the winter weather, in the autumn, it's the landscape here is made for rain. It's so
Mm.
green, and we have the hills all around us. We're surrounded by forest here, although sadly a lot of it isn't native forest anymore. We're surrounded by a lot of plantation forest,
Mm.
which it can look beautiful from a distance, but when you're actually in it, it's a bit of a desert actually underneath those trees. But we do
Mhm.
have some little pockets here in the borders in Northumberland of beautiful native forest that would have been part of the Caledonian forest that used to cover Scotland from shore to shore.
Mm.
And there's just so much folklore in the borders. There's just so much to discover, and it's really magical actually to get lost in it.
It's so fascinating to me endlessly how liminal spaces, whether it's the salt marsh between the ocean and the beach, or whether it's on Samhain when you just have a sense that the veil between the worlds is the thinnest, or whether it's the border between two countries, there just seems to be that sense of a collection of energies that are just so fertile in the way that perhaps it's the paradoxes and it's the overlaps and it's the contrasts and it's the way in which people and spirit and biological beings have found ways to create anew where these two different spaces meet.
Mm, yeah. And that shows up time and time again in the Scottish stories. the magic always happens when you're on the bank between loch and shore, or you're where the man-made world turns into the wasteland, or yeah, always in these liminal spaces. And that's supposed to be where you're closest to the other world,
Right.
and where you're most likely to see a ghost or
Mm-hmm.
a fairy, or where you might actually just accidentally slip between worlds.
And actually, there's a story on the podcast from season 1. I'm not sure if you had a chance to hear it, from Michael Newton, who he's an American who's a Scots Gaelic scholar, and he tells the story of a man at a Cailleach who doesn't have a story to tell, and so he's sent out to the well to draw water. And he sees a boat, and he gets inside that boat, goes across the loch. You look like you know what story this is,
Yeah,
right?
I know it and I love it.
Yes. So for our listeners who haven't heard it yet, he goes across and becomes a woman for a time and inhabits her life and becomes fully immersed in it until one day, well, they'll have to go back, and I'll leave the link to the story. They'll have to go back and hear it. But it's a wonderful liminal spaces sort of story that draws in human experience as well as all, the nature and the spirit of the land and itself.
And you feel that when you're out in the wild spaces, that feeling that actually anything is possible right now. You could easily just slip into another world or another life. And a bit like in the story, the Queen of the Fairies might just appear from seemingly nowhere.
Yeah, any hill could carry any secret in an entire other world, right?
Mm, yeah.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about you as storyteller and how I appreciate hearing that you traveled for a long time before coming back to home. How did these stories find a home in you?
Mm. So I grew up with my dad telling me stories, making up stories at bedtime.
Hmm.
He would just create a story out of anything I threw at him. And eventually I started doing that myself. So I've been a storyteller right from childhood. I love telling stories, and I loved reading books about mythology and other religions. I actually, now I can't remember exactly how old I was, and I was supposed to check with my mum before we had this interview, but I think I was about 11, 10 or 11. I got a lot of books out of the library about different religions, and I loved the Hindu myths and the Hindu stories and pictures of the goddesses and the gods in the books. There's something so vibrant about them. And I actually asked my mum and dad if I could become Hindu. I don't think I really understood how that worked.
Right.
And they were very good about it. They didn't give me a reality check or anything, about how that might not be as easy as I was imagining. But I just love the stories of other worlds, of gods and goddesses and magical other realms. And I just loved it from such a young age. And as I got older and I went traveling, I began to see the stories. I was lucky enough to see, beautiful artwork on temple walls in India and Southeast Asia. And I sort of started collecting stories. I mean, it wasn't an intentional thing to begin with. I was just
Mm.
enjoying them as I went. But eventually it became more intentional, and I was writing down, and I had notebooks and notebooks of stories. And when I returned to Scotland, I just realized that they're not my stories necessarily to tell.
Mm.
And around about the same time, I was called in very kindly by some wonderful Southeast Asian friends. And just they very kindly told me, they're not my stories to tell. And
Mm.
using them might be cultural appropriation.
Mm.
And I just felt wretched because I love these stories. And I wanted so much to be able to see myself in these goddesses and these powerful women that I'd seen. And yeah, when I finally discovered Cailleach and Bride and Bridget and all of the many strong, incredible Irish goddesses and female characters and female warriors in the mythology here,
Mm.
I was just delighted. I couldn't learn them fast enough. Like
Right.
I love to tell them. Mm.
Oh, Katie, I so appreciate that story and that your story of coming to find the stories that you were meant to tell. And yeah, the whole question of cultural appropriation is such a difficult one. We feel in our bones and in ourselves and in our hearts, and it brings tears saying, wait, I'm trying to honor and wait, did I do it the right way? How do we tread carefully? I'm always so aware of that myself as an American, saying, yeah, I may have some lineage in Ireland and Scotland, but how do I hold and honor and give space to other voices and know that I'm a storyteller too? And how do I keep learning from those who were raised in these stories or who just walked these stories in your bones, right? Like that sense of
Mm.
when you're walking outside, you're walking on what the Cailleach fell from her creel. And I'm always aware that I don't know the stories here of New York, of the Lenape people in that same way. And I'm not sure that I ever can, but I'm still trying. But thank you for sharing that reflection.
Yeah. And there is a beauty in connecting to the land wherever you are in the world through the stories that belong to that land. Like I had a really profound experience listening to the stories from Aboriginal people in Australia about the land.
Mhm.
And to me, Australia was just so alien and otherworldly compared to Scotland and Northumberland. It's
Mm.
red dust, and the stories there just like came alive because they just belonged so much to that land, and I could see it all happening, like the rainbow serpent and all the different incredible mystical beings that they have over there. But yeah, they're not mine either. So
And yet
mm,
they still invite us in to open something new for us that says, how can I, again, honor this, carry it carry the energy of it perhaps, and imbue it with something else. I dreamt I was in Australia last night. So it's just, again, there's no
no.
coincidences in any of this. And it was this remarkable story of, well, it's the other side of the world from where I am. So it's that sense of, right, I went there with my husband, and it was a moment of changing jobs, changing work, changing everything, reacquainting. And
Mm.
it makes sense that the unconscious would pull out a place on the other side of the world. But I just remember, well, I haven't been there myself, but it was blue in my dream, that it was being on the water and this blue sky and blue ocean. So whatever that's worth. And now here we are talking of blue-skinned Cailleachs, a few,
Yeah.
from the other side of the earth. This is where I just always want to make room for my like, gee whiz, this is neat sort of sense, because the wonder of all this is meant to be noticed and held, like just in the way that as Bride is weeping and the violets are appearing from her tears, and the way that you named so many plants and the birds all coming through, like each one of those is such an opportunity for wonder, and knowing like someone wrapped that in narrative because that was a part of their natural world that was always there, that deserved recognition, and that once upon a time was easier to recognize before we were looking at our phones and doing all the things that we do today. But thank you for that, just that weaving and that, and bringing us there with that natural honoring.
Mhm. And I think that's why these stories are so important.
Mhm.
They, whether it's me telling the tale of the Cailleach and the landscape where, her horse's hooves have made imprints in the earth, or you have Clackaran at the falls of Connell where the Cailleach's goats cross the water. We have these parts of the landscape that are protected and preserved and held by the story, and it makes them important. It
Mhm.
makes people want to protect them. It's the same in Australia. There are so many places across the landscape are sacred to the Aboriginal people, and the stories protect them and remember them. And
Mhm.
all of these stories, wherever we are in the world, they're telling us to love the earth.
Yeah. Oh, it feels perfect that we're kind of ending with this power of place names, because I know that's so important to you and the way that you hold these stories. I hope it's not too much to ask. I would love a little list of the places that you've named in this story, just for so people could just kind of be with them and the names, and even pronounce whether they can pronounce them well or not when looking at them on the page. I feel like there's just that power and resonance of, well, actually, I think when you and I were speaking before the interview, I mentioned this book by Keith Basso called Wisdom Sits in Places, and it's about the language of the Western Apache. But one of the things that I believe the writer was a white man who was spending a great deal of time with the Apache. But one of the things that the elders said to him was the importance of pronouncing things correctly, not out of a desire to shame anyone, but to say these words were in the mouths of the ancestors. And I'm going to use this word again here, but that sense of we're honoring the ancestors and those who came before by uttering the place name and by speaking it aloud again.
Yeah. And protecting the language. And there's been a huge rising of the popularity of learning Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic, and it's on Duolingo now. It's crazy figures for the amount of people worldwide that have started learning Gaelic.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm quite a beginner to learning Gaelic as well, and I don't find learning languages easy, but I just think it's so important. It's such an ancient language and it belongs to these lands, and it protects and preserves not just the language and the words, but the names for places come from a time when humans had a deeper and more personal relationship with nature and the earth. So there's just so much to learn from that and from the names and from the Gaelic names for plants and trees. And, they give hints to their medicinal uses and their folkloric uses. It is so important to remember and connect to native languages, wherever we are.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a difference to be in a place that's named for a geological feature made by a goddess than by the dude who allegedly discovered a space, right? Like what happens when we just sit with that sense of like, oh, there's a lot of layers here. Which one are we resonating with? Is it with, in the case of being in the States, is it with the colonizer, or is it with the people who came here before? And can we learn the oldest names? Well, as we say farewell today, I do hope that we'll get you back for more stories, perhaps around Samhain. Is there any other bit of wisdom or thought around Bride and the Cailleach story, or any other elements that you'd like to bring to us as we say farewell?
Just that I would love to invite you to look for her in the landscape, for the Cailleach or Bride, whichever you feel connected to most. Yeah, look for her. Look for the Cailleach's cloak on the mountaintops as it lies there drying, Look for Bride's footsteps when you see primroses, or her tears when you see violets. Just keep an eye out. And maybe you might hear the eagle shriek for joy, and she's near, and maybe just take a moment to feel her close.
That brings tears to my eyes. Katy, thank you so much for bringing your stories and your open heart. It's been such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to the Not Work Storytelling Podcast. Please subscribe and review the show on your favorite podcast platform, and do share this episode with other lovers of myth and story. By the way, everyone is a lover of myth and story, even if they've forgotten. Creating this show is a labor of love, and your support will help me continue to craft and share stories through season 3 and beyond. Please consider becoming a paid subscriber over on Substack, where I'm writing and creating additional audio magic with my newsletter and content hub, Myth is Medicine. You can find out more about my writing, my book, our online creative community, The Heroine's Knot, as well as how to work with me as a coach at marisagowdy.com. Music on the show is by the wonderful Beth Sweeney and Billy Hardy, a Celtic fiddle and multi-instrumental duo based on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The traditional reel we play at the start of the show is called the College Groves. Find out more about their music and shows at billyandbeth.com. Gratefully, I live, write, work, and record this podcast on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape tribe, whose name means original people.